Karen facilitated an FCNL workshop that I attended last year, whose goal was to have civil, constructive conversations with people who seem to be across an enormous gulf. In tonight's address, Karen will take us even further into the exercise of listening for the deeper truths being expressed by those on the distant shores. And Karen will be speaking out of the silence.
I want to thank you. How's the level? Is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay. I want to thank you for inviting me here. The title of my talk tonight is Love Your Enemies, Pray for Those Who Persecute You. First, I want to say that I realize that some of you may have difficulty with the Bible and may have come even though you don't like dealing with the Bible, but this is a quote from Matthew. And you might have trouble listening to my talk because of that. But I would ask that you use different ears to listen, ears that one of your deceased members used and was her message, Maureen Piles, and listen in tongues. I found that when I speak, I need to speak in my own language. I can't translate for you. I don't know what your language is, but for me to be authentic, I need to speak in my language. So please practice that if you need to. Thank you. The Bible verse of my title is from Matthew, as I said, and it's part of a collection of love statements. No, let me call them love commandments that Jesus gave. Love your neighbor as yourself is probably the best known and is the basis for much of early Quakerism. My degree in Quaker studies from Earlham School of Religion, I kept coming across that use of that as a basis for what the advices and queries were. The other major well-known statement is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which of course is found in Christianity and most other major religions. But even though we who try to live out Jesus's word know what he says, know what he wants, we still haven't been very good at carrying this out. My talk tonight will explore some of why this happens and what we can do about it. As I contemplate these verses, I can't help but contrast what Jesus is asking us to do against how the Old Testament prophet Jonah acted when he was asked to preach to his enemy, not to love his enemy, to preach to his enemy. We probably can all readily remember the part of the story of Jonah where he got swallowed by a whale or a big fish or whatever your translation says, and then was expelled and landed safely on the shore. Whether we believe it or not doesn't matter for my talk. I want to focus on the part that we never talk about, what comes before and what comes after. Jonah ended up in the port of Joppa, where he boarded the ship, because he was running away from God. Specifically, he was running away from what God wanted him to do. God wanted him to preach to the people of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city of Babylon, which was Israel's enemy. And in fact, Israel lived in captivity to Babylon for many years. I don't know about you, but I'm with Jonah. I don't think I want to go to the city of my enemies and preach to them that they need to reform their ways. I'm guessing he would be afraid because I sure would. That's why Jonah fled to Joppa and ended up in trouble. The experience of the whale or the big fish was enough for him to rethink it. He finally decided to carry out God's wishes. So Jonah braved it. He walked up and down the alleys and the main streets of Joppa, preaching that the city needed to repent. Amazingly enough, they did. But, and here's the really human part, instead of rejoicing, they listened to him and acted. Jonah was downcast. Why? Because he had been anticipating with joy that the joy that he would feel when God destroyed that city. Today we'd call it Schadenfreude. He thought there would be fireworks. So he picked a spot to sit outside the city to watch Israel's enemies being destroyed. And when it wasn't, he cried bitter tears. God saw those tears and he recognized Jonah's feelings. And he tells him to be glad that the people didn't lose their lives. But Jonah can't. He cannot. That's because even though Jonah did as God asked, it took a lot for him to get to do that. He did it, but his heart didn't change. I tell that story because Jonah's reactions are true to our humanity. Even though Jonah's a prophet from God, he's still a human. The Jonah story, and indeed much of the Old Testament, illustrates the tribal identity that is a core part of us, a core part of our humanness. We Quakers may celebrate the testimony of community, but there's a dark side to the desire to belong. We define our group by who we aren't. We define our group by our enemies. That's what makes Jesus' instruction to love our enemies so difficult. It goes against how we are made. Do you want to hang out with people who are like you or people who aren't like you? I tend to hang out with people like me. Sorry, I'm human. And who's your enemy? Is someone your enemy just because he's in a different group or believes something different or comes from a different perspective? Or is he an enemy because they treat us badly? Another story comes to mind when I think about this verse. I was at an FGC plenary a while ago when John Shelby Spong gave a talk on love. Bishop Spong, who died last year, was a retired bishop of the Episcopal Church in New Jersey, in my area. And he was the first bishop to ordain an openly gay man. And I was talking about this last Thursday in the meeting I attend. A woman who was in his diocese told me that she thought he had done wonderful things for the LGBT community in the Diocese of Newark in New Jersey. And she very much missed him. So I attended his talk at the FGC plenary. I don't remember the text of his actual talk, but I vividly remember the question and answer period. A woman got up and she asked a question about how to respond in a situation, and the situation was awful. It was truly awful. Bishop Spong's response was that you should love the person. The questioner protested. The situation was worse than what she described. It was really hateful. His response was the same. Love them anyway. The questioner continued about how terrible it was, really terrible. But the answer was the same. Love them anyway. That's how tough this is. Our world is divided politically and even inside of Quakerism. We have these tensions all around us. We don't know how to deal with people who are different than we are, who appear to want things different than we do. As I've been traveling virtually and in person throughout the Quaker world, I see these tensions. I see people who leave their meeting because of theological differences. Those who are uncomfortable with the way their meeting is approaching anti-racism work. And I've seen yearly meetings disintegrate over the issue of being welcoming and affirming to LGBTQ persons. We don't know how to resolve these tensions. We don't know how to talk to them, much less do we know how to love our enemy. And again, why are they our enemy? How can we solve this? How can we get past our programming, that part of us, that human part? Our brain wiring is based on centuries of evolution, but it doesn't serve us in this way. We need a software upgrade. We need a software upgrade in our brain. So I have some ideas of how we can upgrade our wiring. Some are drawn from early Quakers, some from psychology, anthropology research, and some from the Bible. I've been personally working to apply some of these techniques in my own life, and I'll share some of my stories with you. So early Quakers, one of the things that really surprised me when I started reading early Quaker history was that instead of using the words "that of God within us," which they did use, but they had lots of other words. And the ones that I really loved the most were the words, "the seed of God." They contrasted the seed of God with the seed of man, which we also carry with us. The tribalism that Jonah displayed is a manifestation of the seed of man. An enemy, just the fact of having an enemy, is a manifestation of the seed of man. And that isn't what God wants us to do. That's not what Jesus says. So instead, we need to pay attention to the seed of God. Early Quaker Isaac Pennington spoke about it in this way. This is the sum or substance of our religion, to wit, to feel, and to discern the two seeds, the seed of enmity and the seed of love, the seed of the flesh and the seed of the spirit, and to feel the judgments of God administered to one of these till it be brought into bondage and death, and the other to be raised up in the love and mercy of the Lord to live in us, and our souls gathered into it, to live to God in it. We have a choice of what we pay attention to, of what we feed. Whatever we feed grows. Whatever we spend time doing, whatever we spend time reading, whatever we spend time talking about and praying about expands. When we give into the conflict, when we regard someone as our enemy, we're feeding the seed of man. So my first recommendation for how to rewire our brains is to find ways to feed the seed of God and to avoid feeding the seed of man. It may mean not watching the news. It may mean taking a social media fast. It may mean changing what you read to things that feed the seed of God in you, and not to feed things that feed the seed of man. Specifically, don't watch stories that pillory those who disagree with you. And definitely avoid those who the author Amanda Ripley has called conflict entrepreneurs, those who profit from provoking division. Avoiding them starves them of attention. Instead, look for uplifting stories, stories of how people have applied these principles in their lives and how they grow in their seed of God. Another way to grow the seed of God in you is to form a community that supports you in this journey of making changes, one that can help people see and experience the seed of God in themselves, one that can build a blessed community. We need to hang out with people who want to solve the divide. That will help the movement to grow. I've been blessed to be part of several communities like that. One of them is my Quaker meeting in New Jersey, which is Broadway Plainfield, located in Plainfield, New Jersey, named after the Quakers, Plainfields. It's not perfect, but the community there has helped me grow in faith, and to pay more attention to the seed of God. That's how I ended up leaving my job about 10 years ago and going to seminary. I definitely would not have done that if I hadn't sat faithfully in worship week after week after week and hung out in a supportive community that gave me a care committee, and they supported me through, emotionally and spiritually supported me through that journey. Does your Quaker meeting fill that role for you? If not, can you encourage it to change? Or do you belong to another community that fills that role? If not, please find one. I've got a chapter in my book about how to know if it's a community that does that. After we've found a community, we can start paying attention to ourselves. After all, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, not instead of yourself. That doesn't mean sitting on the couch eating bonbons all day, although that sounds attractive to me on a theoretical level. But what it means for me, what I've learned it means for me, is becoming aware of our bodily needs, eating nutritious food, getting exercise, resting when we're tired, paying attention to our emotional needs. It means taking a break from a conversation when we feel overwhelmed. It means rewarding ourselves when we've done something hard, even if it's just a private kudos, a little pat on the back, Karen. A mnemonic to remember is HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If you're any of those things, take a break. Take care of yourself. So over the last couple of weeks, I faced a challenge with my husband being ill, and it's been difficult for me to apply this principle in my own life. I needed to take care of myself while still meeting his needs. One night I chose to stay at the emergency room way past my bedtime and didn't drink enough fluids. which I really paid for it the next day. I can't be there for others. I can't pay attention to others until I take care of my own needs. And that's why if you've been on an airplane, they tell you in case of turbulence, you put on your own oxygen mask before you put on someone else's. Another story to illustrate my point. I was clerking a meeting and one of the group members kept raising her hand to speak, and then somebody else would want to speak and she would just let the other person speak. Happened over and over again. And then we ran out of time and she didn't get to speak. Instead of gracefully accepting the lack of time, this person exploded at me, of course. She wasn't taking care of her needs. She was paying attention to what other people needed and not what she needed. She just couldn't maintain it. She needed to take care of herself first, to love herself. Another aspect of taking care of ourselves is uncovering if our reactions might be the result of trauma. If that's the case, then we need to heal the trauma and not blame the other person. And not blame the other person if we're overreacting, because that's what trauma does to us. It makes us overreact. There's lots of new research about overcoming trauma. I've been blessed with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I've been able to overcome it through using some of these techniques. Even before I read about them, I happened to find the right people. Any of you know Quaker John Calvi. John Calvi does great work in this area, and I've been blessed to attend one of his workshops. There's plenty of people, plenty of places to go for help, but you need to get help for the trauma before you can start doing anything else. So once we've given enough to ourselves so we don't feel deprived and we've dealt with any trauma, we need to take the next step to look at our part in things. Psychologists tell us that the things that disturb us most are often projections of our own behavior and thoughts. If we're concerned about someone else's behavior, that's usually because we have something in our own lives that we feel uneasy about. Part of our unease happens because, after all, we live in the real world and we need to make trade-offs all the time. We can't be perfect. We can't live totally consistent lives. And because we're human with human faults. But we often remain willfully blind to our own faults. We become defensive and we wall off any criticism of ourselves and perish the thought that we could root out those defects and heal them. But when we point the finger at someone else, there are three fingers pointing back at us. Jesus recognized this also when he said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. Take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." I've also been blessed to be part of a recovery community that does this routinely. I've learned that if I'm upset about someone else's behavior, that I need to look about what's going on inside of me, in my own makeup. It makes me react that way. What benefit do I get from pointing the finger? Does it feed my ego, my desire to feel superior to someone else? Does it come from my belief that I'm right about everything? My personal journey is to learn to say two phrases that are each 3 words long. I don't know, and I'm wrong, as much as I can. I practice those. Early Quakers were passionate about hypocrisy. They were always pointing out how behavior of others didn't live up to what they said. But, and this is a big but, they were also ruthless about uprooting their own hypocrisy. As Marcel Martin describes in her book, Our Life is Love, they used the inward light of God as a searchlight to uncover their issues, their defects, and to root them out. It was painful. They used words like the refiner's fire or the fuller brush. Ooh. We also might call it the dark night of the soul. In her book, Marcel Martin quotes early Quaker Richard Harberthorne as he describes this process in his own life. The power of God had caused a great flame to enter me, to destroy the lust that had fed on stolen waters and bread gotten by deceit. for I have fed upon vanity and lies. And the earlier quote from Isaac Pennington that I referenced, he talked about the bondage and death of the seed of the flesh. It's a painful process. We have to uproot the seed of man in us that we all have. I've been through a few dark nights of the soul when I faced up to my own issues, my own desire to control that has its roots in a fear of uncertainty. My plan for the last couple of weeks wasn't to spend time in the hospital. I was supposed to be in Switzerland on vacation. And instead, I'm in a hospital in New Jersey, 2 different hospitals in New Jersey. The world is a messy, uncertain place, and we never really know what's next. Accepting that is one of the major tasks of life, and many of us never accept that. Another reason to look at our own behavior is that the only person we can change is ourselves. If we want change, then we have to change. And if we want peace, then we need a peaceful heart. As the Dalai Lama has said, if we ourselves remain angry and then sing world peace, it has little meaning. First, our individual self must learn peace. This we can practice. Then we can teach the rest of the world. We need to rewire our brain to change our hearts to a peaceful heart. So I've talked a lot about paying attention to yourself. Pay attention to your needs. Heal your trauma if you have any, and deal with your faults. After you've done that, which is, just a little task. And you know what? You're never going to be done if you're anything like me. You can pay attention to the other, but in a new way. I put taking care of yourself and understanding yourself first because we can't really do the work of approaching the other in a new way until we have taken care of ourselves. So now I come to the really outrageous statement I'm going to make. I believe it is unethical to not understand the other. I believe that God has put us here in this world with people who are different than we are because he wants us to learn to work together. We're all children of God. We've been given different gifts for a reason. God wants us to be different. Paul talks about this in his first letter to the Corinthians, saying there is but one body, but it has many parts, but all its many parts make up one body. I apply this concept in a lot of different ways. When I take a walk on a rainy or snowy day, I think about how even though I like days like today, God made all of them. They're all gifts from God. And even more than that, we shouldn't just learn to accept and understand the gifts of others, the differences. We should celebrate them because they're all gifts from God. And when we don't understand the other, when we don't understand other people, we become stupid. Jonathan Haidt talks about this when you hear him being interviewed. He talks about how stupid we become. We need the variety of viewpoints to see the reality of the world and to come up with new creative solutions for the wicked problems. Now, wicked problems, I mean things like climate change. I mean things like poverty. I mean things like racism. If we can't see the world through other people's eyes, we will never solve these problems. So much of our differences arise out of our different gifts, our different contexts. We need to work to understand them. We need to pay attention in such a way to understand the other. This is part of undoing our tribalism. Tribalism is not just the seed of man, it also makes us stupid. So let me repeat. It is unethical to not understand the other. We need to celebrate our differences and love them. So I've been on this journey for a few years, and I've been collecting tools to help us understand the other. I put the ones related to morality in my book, Persuade, Don't Preach, which is available to be sold. Too often, we are preaching and not paying attention to what's important to the other person. The point of the book is if we understand what's underneath what the other person is saying, if we understand their morality behind the opinions that seem mysterious to us, we will be able to understand what we have, first of all, understand what we have in common with the other person, how we all share the same, we all have the same moral foundations. They just look different and we put different importance on them, but they're the same ones. We need to be able to see that. And this work has been done, not just in the US, the work has been done across cultures, and they keep finding the same thing over and over again. So when I say we share the same morality, I mean all of us humans. Our differences arise as we give different emphases to the moral foundations and as we use different interpretations of them. We need to learn about these. And once we can see them, which is what happened to me, when I read The Righteous Mind, I started seeing the world in a different way. And I started seeing ways you could apply it. And then I would talk to people and they wouldn't see it. I was like, I'd explain it to them and they'd go, oh. And that's why I wrote the book, because I needed to explain it. But once we can see beyond that our morality is different, once we can see what their framework is, we can talk to people in a more persuasive way. And that's what I mean by persuade, don't preach. Now, this is important and as we face the divisions in our own country, but it's even more important to use to understand the developing world. As I understand, Gretchen spoke about her experience in Africa and how different it was, and not to make assumptions about what is true. I'm going to throw out an academic term. We in the United States are in what psychologists called a weird country. That's W-E-I-R-D. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Weird. And we in the weird countries have a certain dominant morality. And we think that's the right way to act. But those in the developing world, they have a different morality profile. It isn't right to try to impose our system on them. And I'll tell you a story to illustrate what happens when we try this. I heard a story about a hospital from a religious denomination in Kenya. And they were facing an issue with the administrator of the hospital. They had been attempting to unwind the legacy of colonialism, and they stopped bringing in administrators from out of the country, from the rich world, and they hired a Kenyan to administer the hospital. That person then proceeded to spend the hospital budget on his extended family instead of maintaining the hospital. So they fired that person and they hired another Kenyan. Same thing happened again. Now, I don't know the final resolution of the story, but the person who told me this story told me that when they read The Righteous Mind, they started to understand what was going on. It helped them understand what was underneath the person not spending the money on the hospital. It wasn't something bad in their selection process. They needed to understand the pressures that the person they hired was put under because of the moral system all around them that they were caught up in. Now, I don't know how they solved it, but without understanding that, they couldn't even begin to solve the problem. So we in the US, in the developed world, in the weird world, need to understand the morality of the rest of the world on a deep level. As people from a weird culture, we're probably placing more importance on 2 of the moral foundations. Now, Haidt says there's 5, I say there's 7, but whatever. I'll talk about his. The 2 we tend to place most importance on is care for others and fairness. But even though we pay more attention to those 2, that doesn't mean we shouldn't respect the other ones, which are sacredness, belonging, and authority. We need to honor and recognize what people find sacred. And we need to recognize what we feel sacred. So we feel the commonality of that we both find things sacred. They're different, but we both have sacred things. And we need to recognize the tribalism, the community, how important it is, but how we have to change it, as I've been talking about the tribalism. It's important, but we need to change it. And we need to recognize the value of having good authorities. I sometimes say when I give a talk that when I was named clerk on my meeting, people started treating me differently. because I had but I treated the meeting differently because I had a responsibility to them. We need to recognize the authority. Once I gave a talk, sometimes when I give a talk, I have people take the inventory to see what their profile is. And in the question and answer period afterwards, somebody said, but I have 0 on respect for authority. What should I do? And I said, well, is it important to have a good leader? And she said, yes. If we practice these, if we can see these, then maybe we can start to convince others. We can persuade and not preach. As I've been talking to people around the country about my book, I've been uncovering other tools, and I'm going to highlight one of them tonight for you. This comes originally from a woman I never met, but I heard about her. Her name is Bonnie Tinker. Some of you may know or have met her. She's from St. Louis, I believe. She's no longer with us. I think she developed it as a lobbying tool in Oregon, but I think it can be used more broadly to understand others. And she drew on a lot of sources to develop it, and I adapted it somewhat, and I'll give you my version of it. The basics of it are asking questions, sounds simple, listening, affirming, and responding. Asking questions sounds simple, harder than it sounds. We often ask leading questions, questions that help get our viewpoint across. Or we make assumptions that we know what the other person's thinking, or what they believe, or what they feel. But instead, what we need to do is ask questions based in curiosity. Now, curiosity is a whole topic in itself. There's books based on curiosity also. But I think we push down our curiosity because we were trained in school that we have to know the answers. We don't. Research shows that people who ask questions, who are curious, are considered to be more intelligent than people who don't. It's more intelligent to ask curious questions. The second step in her process is to listen. And again, whole books have been written on this, but we're often rehearsing our own answers instead of listening. And we're often just, if we are listening, we're listening with our brain. We need to listen with our whole body, with our heart. We need to listen with emotions. This one is the hardest one for me, and I'm still working on this. The third step is really lovely, which is affirming. How often do we tell people what we disagree with about what they said instead of saying what we agree with? Even if we disagree with most of it, if we can at least say what we agree with, that sets a common ground. And after you've done these 3 steps, you will have built up a reservoir of goodwill with the other person. And they'll probably, not always, but probably be ready to listen to you for a change. And that's when you get a chance to say something. This requires a lot of self-discipline, which is why I said take care of yourself first. But if you've been taking care of yourself, then you're more likely to be able to do this successfully. There's been research done on a similar technique used in lobbying called deep canvassing. And it has been shown to be successful in changing people's minds. When you listen to someone else, it makes them more open to listening to you. It makes them consider what they think. And there's this psychological thing about people who we might disagree with, that there's something called high need for cognitive closure. I talk about this in the book. People want to come to a point of view quickly. They want an answer quickly, and they don't want to think. But when we do this process, any of these processes, we make people stop and think. And when they stop and think, things can change. Things can change. So I've written about this particular tool, and I have other ones that I found in my newsletter, which is free on the internet, called Mending Fractured Relationships. And I am in the process of writing a book by the same name. So I think we finished enough right now with paying attention to the other. Then you need to circle back to yourself. How does what you learn compare to your gifts, compare to your context? What's different? What are the commonalities? What do they do that you admire? What have you learned about yourself? When we do this, we may uncover more commonalities than we expect. And we expand our sense of what is true and real. Now, once you've explored these tools, you're better able to make translations of what the other is saying. As I talked to people who had problems with the Bible early on, this is a tool we all use, we can all learn to use, to listen in tongues. Those of you who know your Bible know that at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came down and people began speaking in tongues. Well, we need a new Pentecost, one where we listen in tongues. The final recommendation I'm going to make is a spiritual one. My newsletter and my book are both secular, so you won't find this tool in either of these places. But I found this to be a very powerful tool in my own life. And that tool is to pray. And after all, that's what Jesus told us to do. He said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. I know prayer is a touchy subject. There's studies that purport to say that prayer does help those who are being prayed for. Some say that prayer helps to cause the fall of the Berlin Wall. I don't know if I believe any of it, it doesn't matter. But I do believe that prayer works to change my heart when I pray. But it only works when I pray in a certain way. It doesn't work if you pray for them to change. It works for me to pray to have good things happen to them. This brings to mind a story from my last full-time job, when probably the only time in my life I could say I had an enemy. I literally had an enemy. She was my nemesis. My boss would go into a meeting where they would fight over at that level who was going to get a raise, who was going to get a promotion, and she would block me all the time. My boss would try to help me come up with strategies for how to deal with this. What did I do? I'm not proud of myself, but I retaliated. I gossiped. I told everyone I met about how terrible she was, and I solicited stories of other terrible things she had done. And what got resolved? Nothing. Literally nothing. After I left that job, I decided I didn't like how I was behaving. I didn't like what I was becoming. I was feeding the seed of man in me by doing this. So I decided to pray for her. And praying for her changed my heart. I had left my job, so I didn't have to interact with her, but I was still afraid of her. I was trying to get consulting work in the same field, and I was afraid of what she could do to my reputation, which, given what she had done to me, was a very real fear. So it just so happened I went to an industry conference where she was to find some business, and I ended up talking to her, and I actually sat next to her at dinner. I had a perfectly reasonable conversation about our children. Now, she's never going to be my best friend, and I would never choose to work with her, but I could have a good conversation with her. I couldn't have done that before I started praying for her. I've used this tool in other ways. I've decided to unwind my unconscious racism by praying for people of another race whenever I see people of that profile. My prayer is for blessings to come to them and their ancestors. I've recently begun praying for people who have assigned for a candidate I disagree with. And I've been praying for truckers because I think we need them. I said earlier that my husband's been ill for a couple of weeks, and during his illness at one point, we were both kind of cranky and said some things that were not really nice. I spent one night ruminating on those things. What stopped it for me was praying for him. I prayed for him to get better. First thing that happened is I was able to go to sleep. Second thing that happened is in the morning, I was able to focus on what I needed to do for his illness instead of focusing on the things we had said. So, how can you apply for this? How can you apply this in your life? Pray for a politician of the opposite party. Pray for their supporters. Even consider praying for Vladimir Putin. I've done that a few times. I don't do it every day, but I've done it a few times. As Jesus said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Jonah illustrates how hard it is to do this because we need to rewire those brains that have been evolved over centuries. But it is possible to change our program. I've given you some recommendations for how to get started on this journey based on Quaker history, psychology, and spirituality to grow the seed of God in you and overcome the seed of man that causes conflict. Hang out with others on the same journey. Create a community to support you. Ignore those who try to ignite conflict. Take care of yourself. Resolve to root out hypocrisy. Gather tools to understand the other and circle back to yourself, and use prayer to change your heart. What are you willing to do? What are you committed to? Please join me on this journey. May God be with you, opening your heart and feeding your soul. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Thank you.